You awake in the middle of the night. Your eyes slowly open as you realize that you have to pee. So you get up, stumble to the bathroom, and turn on the light. Wait a second. Where are your blackout curtains? And why is the room so dirty? That's right. It's summertime in ancient Rome, and you've got a case of deadly malaria. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. We be talking about what you would struggle with if you were alive in ancient times. This particular episode will focus on ancient Rome and things that we take for granted today that would actually be very difficult to deal with if you were living in the Roman Empire. As always, this video is meant to help you fall asleep, so it's rather slow-paced and monotone. Emperor Marcus Aurelius has died, and his son Commodus has taken the throne. People across the empire have been celebrating in the streets. The Senate is throwing gold coins from their balconies as common folk fight over the riches. Being an ordinary Roman, you decide to stay home and keep yourself safe from the rabble-rousers, locking your door and hoping that whatever they decide to do next can stay far away from you. But your dinner tastes bland. No oil or vinegar, no bread, salt, or meat. There isn't even water running through the pipes, and it seems like the whole city is in shambles. Oh, that's right. The aqueducts and the public bathrooms aren't working anymore. No wonder there was no water. You may think nothing of getting up to go use the bathroom, but in ancient Rome, this was no simple task. In most homes, there wasn't even an indoor bathroom. If you were lucky enough to have one, then you had to fill your own basin and carry it out to a public bathroom, hoping you weren't too close to the gladiator games happening at the Colosseum. Even in the public bathrooms, you might find yourself waiting in line. And don't forget, this is during the height of summer in Rome, and the toilets never really smelled like roses. The gladiators are fighting in the center of the arena as crowds cheer from the stands. The smell of blood and sweat fills the air while you desperately try to protect your eyes from the bright sunlight beating down onto the sand. Not only would you struggle with keeping your cool in the sweltering heat, but protecting your eyes would also be difficult. Gladiators are swinging their swords, jumping over fallen opponents, and trying to survive. For you, surviving the game might mean covering your face in protective cloth or sitting in the shade. But for the gladiators, it meant fighting for their lives against other men who have just as much grit and determination as they do. Emperor Commodus is standing in front of the crowd. He waves to his adoring fans as they chant his name and praise him for the victories of the Roman army. It doesn't matter that there wasn't a battle for miles around. These people love their emperor and they love a good fight. But you didn't come here for the blood sport. You came to see the Colossus of Rome. After all, this is the largest statue in the entire empire, and perhaps the greatest marvel of engineering. Standing over 100 feet tall, the statue looks over the city of Rome from atop a hill, reminding everyone of the power and majesty of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, Emperor Commodus is so egotistical that he has decided to have the Colossus remodeled to look more like himself, and honestly, it's kind of awkward. To top it off, the maintenance on the statue has been lacking, and pieces of stone are starting to fall from its exterior. Perhaps standing too close to the Colossus of Rome may not be such a great idea after all. The year is 180 AD, and you live in a small village near the Tiber River. You wake up early, grab your bucket, and head out to collect water from the river. Sure, the aqueducts are broken, and there isn't clean drinking water in the village. But that doesn't stop you from collecting water for your daily needs. While filling your bucket, you notice that the water is filled with trash and dead animals. Perhaps a better spot along the river would be better, but at least there is water. After all, the last time the village experienced a drought, several children had died. You take your bucket home, boil some water, and pour yourself a glass. You take a sip and wince. Water is scarce, and the pipes haven't been cleaned in years. Who knows what diseases you could catch from drinking water like this? At least you can boil it first, right? Wrong. One of the most dangerous parts of ancient Rome was the water itself. People would become sick and die from bacteria-filled water that sat stagnant in the pipes. If you were able to afford it, you could buy clean water delivered by an aqua, but this was expensive, and you needed to plan ahead because they wouldn't necessarily deliver every day. Boiling your water was also a bad idea because the water wasn't pure. When you boiled it, it released more toxins into the air and left more minerals and impurities in the water. You stand outside the Colosseum. All around you are people dressed in colorful robes, some haggling over the price of food, others trying to keep their distance from the chained-up prisoners being paraded around. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were the chains and shackles holding these people captive. Some of them are so rusted and worn that they barely hold together. Imagine being chained up for hours at a time with tools that may snap at any given moment. Oh, and don't forget, this is another hot summer's day in Rome. Being in chains when it's nearly 100 degrees out is definitely not a pleasant experience. The chariot races are about to start, and the crowd is roaring with excitement. Chariots thunder past you as you walk alongside the racetrack, trying to avoid the flying rocks and clods of dirt being thrown from their wheels. You couldn't help but marvel at the skill of the charioteers guiding their teams of horses around the track. They fly around the corners and whip their horses into a frenzy as the crowd cheers. The dust fills your lungs and makes your eyes water. You may not be participating in the race, but it's still painful just watching the charioteers push themselves and their horses to the limit. The horses snort and paw at the ground as they wait for the race to begin. As the charioteers take their positions, you can hear the tension in the reins. The horses strain forward, and the crowd holds its breath. And now they're off, thundering around the track. You quickly move out of the way, dodging flying rocks and clods of dirt. You watch as the chariots round the corners, nearly clipping each other. Some of the horses stumble, but the charioteers quickly correct them. The crowd roars with excitement as the chariots fly by. The race is intense, and you can feel the energy of the horses pounding the track. The dust fills your lungs and makes your eyes water. The roar of the crowd echoes in your ears. You may not be participating in the race, but just watching the charioteers push themselves and their horses to the limit is breathtaking. The year is 27 BC. Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, has just defeated Cleopatra and her Egyptian army at the Battle of Actium. With Rome now controlling the Mediterranean, you decide to book passage on one of their new Mediterranean cruises. The cruise ship, appropriately named the race Publica, sets sail from the bustling port of Ostia. Soon after leaving the harbor, the ship drops anchor off the coast of Naples. A long boat ride up the coast brings you to the grand city of Rome. You've always dreamed of visiting the Eternal City, and now your dream has come true. The emperor has spared no expense to ensure your stay in Rome will be a vacation to remember. But unfortunately, by the end of the first day, you'll be wishing that you stayed home in bed. Welcome to Rome, where even the emperor can't keep the streets clean. You struggle to breathe through the stench of stale urine, rotting garbage, and dead animals filling your nostrils. This wasn't how you imagined your dream vacation to Rome to go. The emperor's engineers have designed an advanced aqueduct system to bring fresh water into the city. However, there's a problem. While they successfully brought water into the city, they never designed a proper sewage system to remove it. The only toilets in the city are the public bathrooms near taverns and bathhouses. Unfortunately, the emperors who built these structures were far more interested in impressing the citizens with the size of their statues in the public bathrooms than with providing enough toilets. Now you're paying the price. Just when you thought things couldn't get worse, you step in a pile of what appears to be dog or donkey dung. You may have been to other cities in the empire, but the sanitation workers here in Rome seem to be on strike. You make your way through the streets filled with waste, dodging piles of refuse while desperately searching for somewhere to relieve yourself. It's going to be a long week. Emperor Nero has spent huge sums turning his adopted home city of Rome into a luxurious playground for the elite. Unfortunately, he doesn't care about how his building projects affect you, the commoner. While walking down the street, you're forced to navigate around construction sites and half-finished buildings. To make matters worse, the emperor recently passed a new law that all able-bodied citizens must pay a fee to use a public bathroom for you, a tourist trying to see the sights. This could put a damper on your plans. Your tour guide, an enthusiastic young man named Titus, tells you not to worry. You won't need to find a bathroom during the sightseeing tour. He motions to the full glass of wine in your hand. If you drink this entire bottle, he says, you won't need to pee for hours. Well, perhaps that would solve your problem if you didn't have plans to visit the Colosseum tomorrow morning. Emperor Augustus boasts that Rome is the most beautiful city in the world. In an effort to keep the city looking its best, the government has passed laws banning people from defecating, urinating, or even spitting in public. Keep in mind, this isn't the Middle Ages. These are the heady days of the Roman Empire, where technology and engineering marvels are commonplace. And yet, here you are, dodging piles of human excrement in the streets. Rome's population has swelled to over 1 million in recent decades. All those people need to eat, and sadly, the infrastructure hasn't kept up with demand. In addition to the lack of toilets, food vendors and street vendors often use the streets as their own personal bathrooms. Just when you think it can't get any worse, you realize that food left unattended on the streets can quickly disappear. Don't let that happen to you. As soon as you step off the boat in Rome, you learn that stealing isn't just a problem for your luggage, but also your food and money. Since the city is so crowded, you don't dare take your eyes off your plate. When you do, someone nearby quickly swipes your bread or fruit. If you're sitting at a table eating, someone will sneak up behind you and try to grab your wallet. The food vendors add to the chaos, often selling their wares out of baskets on their heads while weaving through the crowds. Just try to enjoy your dinner without getting pickpocketed. After a long day of sightseeing, you're ready to check into your room at the Emperor's lavish inn. The lobby looks nice, but what you don't see are the small pebbles and dirt covering the floor. You ask the desk clerk for a room key, but he tells you that you'll need to bring your own. In ancient Rome, guests were expected to bring their own bedroll and blankets when they visited an inn. The innkeepers provide a place to sleep, but it's up to you to bring your own bedding. You finally make it back to your room, and collapse on the tiny cot. After a quick wash in the communal bathroom, you crawl into bed. Without any sheets or blankets, you huddle under your travel cloak and try to get some sleep. Your dreams are interrupted by the sound of someone snoring loudly in the next room. Emperor Augustus has banned smoking in taverns and public bathrooms. Too bad no one's enforcing the law. You walk into the smoky tavern and cough violently. A group of men playing a dice game glare at you angrily. You need to find a seat, but every table is taken. You're starting to feel like this trip was a mistake. Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, you hear the crash of shattering glass and turn to see a drunk patron kicking over a table. You duck to avoid being hit by flying glass and accidentally spill the contents of a bucket on your head. Emperor Caligula is known for living a life of luxury. He loves nothing more than throwing gold coins from his tower, enjoying the sight of the common folk fighting over the free money. When you arrive in Rome, you notice something strange. There are guards posted outside nearly every business, home, and public building. Their presence is intimidating, but their job is to protect the property inside from theft. Emperor Caligula has recently declared that anyone caught stealing property in the city of Rome will be thrown into the infamous Mamertine prison. You dodge through the crowds and weave between the guards. Their eyes are constantly watching for anyone who seems suspicious. You wonder why you're not worried about getting arrested. The worst part of visiting Rome is the constant threat of war. While most of the provinces in the empire are stable, unrest continues to grow on the frontiers. You arrived in Rome safe and sound, but you don't know what the future holds. Will you return to your ship in one piece? You hope that peace will last long enough for you to finish your vacation. It's time to leave the Eternal City. You board the Res Publica and prepare to set sail for home. As the ship departs the harbor, you breathe a sigh of relief. The captain tells the crew to raise the sails, but the wind is calm. The sailors drop anchor again and tell you that they'll have to wait for a favorable wind to continue the journey. You don't know it yet, but you're in for another surprise. Emperor Augustus has ordered the Res Publica to be fitted with new latrines. The toilets will be installed in the middle of the ship's main hall. You may not have had an enjoyable stay in Rome, but the emperor hopes that your journey home will be much better. Emperor Nero has completed construction of his Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The complex covers 300 acres in the center of the city and includes a massive suite of apartments fit for an emperor. Problem is, he took up so much space that he's left little room for anyone else. You re-wandering through the city, looking for a place to buy a souvenir, when you notice that all the shops seem to be closed. You ask a passerby where you can find some sandals, and he tells you that the shops are closed for the emperor's funeral. You're confused because you saw the emperor just yesterday celebrating his birthday. The man gives you a strange look and tells you that you must have come from another part of the empire. Emperor Nero died 10 months ago, and everyone in the city is still grieving. The person standing next to you begins to cry uncontrollably. His tears fall onto the dusty ground, mixing with the dirt to form small mud puddles. You pat him on the shoulder to try to comfort him, but you only make things worse. The man throws himself on the ground in front of you and wails for the emperor. You quickly apologize and run away. When you book a cruise today, you expect the cruise line to provide adequate bathroom facilities. But in ancient Rome, things were very different. Now check out what really killed ancient Romans. Or watch, did Roman emperors have harems? We'll travel back to ancient Rome and try to live just one day in the city. But there is a twist. We won't have our regular brain, our brain in the present day. So what would happen if your brain from today was put into a body in ancient Rome? Let's find out. Our first obstacle is simply trying to not die. And our modern brains have a lot of advantages when it comes to this. We have so much more medical knowledge than they did back then. This means that even simple things that are dangerous every day for us are very easy to deal with. Cuts and scratches heal themselves most of the time, and illnesses that can be treated with antibiotics would kill you back then. Also, we are used to having access to clean water, which we take for granted, but without it, we wouldn't survive long at all. And of course, we also have indoor plumbing, which is another thing that we don't think about too much, but would definitely be life or death back in ancient times. However, one thing that we do think about a lot nowadays is food and nutrition. We know how important it is to have a balanced diet and get all the vitamins and minerals that we need, and it's something that we obsess over. However, back in ancient times, people didn't really know about nutrition at all. It wasn't until the 18th century that we started to understand the importance of nutrition. And even then, it took decades for that knowledge to spread around the world. So if your brain was put into a body in ancient Rome, you would probably struggle with getting the right nutrition because you would have no idea what you needed. Maybe you would do better than some of the others because you have the knowledge of what foods are healthier than others. But the problem is that you would have no idea how to prepare those foods properly to get all the nutrients that they contain. For example, you might think to yourself, hey, I should eat more spinach because it's healthy. So you start eating a big salad every day. But little do you know that cooking spinach actually makes more nutrients available to your body. Raw spinach has a lot of oxalic acid, which binds to calcium and prevents it from being absorbed by the body. This means that even though spinach is a good source of calcium, you would actually be getting very little of it if you ate it raw. So you might end up with a vitamin D deficiency because of your obsession with eating raw salads. Or maybe you decide to eat fruits because you know that they contain lots of vitamins. But again, you would have no idea how to prepare them. Maybe you would accidentally eat a poisonous plant that looks like an edible fruit. Or maybe you would eat a fruit that should be eaten raw, and it would upset your stomach. And that's just 2 examples. There are so many different things that could go wrong when it comes to food and nutrition. Another thing that you might struggle with is simply finding food. So most people got their food from hunting and gathering. Now, you might think that hunting and gathering is a piece of cake, but it's actually quite difficult to find enough food to eat every day. In fact, studies have shown that people who tried to live off the land using only what primitive humans would have had available to them quickly ran out of food and had to stop. So finding food is hard enough for us today, but it would be almost impossible in ancient Rome. So you might be able to get by for a little while using your knowledge of plants and animals, but eventually you would probably run out of food and starve to death. Even if you were able to get past all these obstacles and get the nutrition you need, you still wouldn't be able to live very long because of the lack of medical knowledge. Imagine cutting yourself and it getting infected, and you know that antibiotics can help you. But in ancient times, there weren't any antibiotics. So the cut would slowly eat away at your body, and eventually you would bleed out and die. Or maybe you could avoid this fate by somehow getting your hands on some bread and milk. Bread and milk was a popular folk remedy back then. The theory was that the lactic acid in the milk would kill the bacteria in the wound and prevent it from getting infected. But of course, this never worked, and it just gave people a false sense of security. Instead of using bread and milk, you should use honey. Honey was used as an antiseptic long before we discovered antibiotics, and it's actually still used today in some hospitals. If you were able to get your hands on some honey, you would be able to treat a lot of infections and stay alive a lot longer. What about mental health? Well, here's the interesting thing. Mental health issues are still very prevalent around the world, and it's believed that the rate of mental illness has been increasing in recent years. In fact, it's estimated that 1 in 5 adults in the US alone will experience a mental illness each year. And this is despite the fact that we have more access to mental health treatment than ever before. So how would someone with a mental illness fare in ancient Rome? Well, it's hard to say, because mental illness wasn't really understood back then. People believed that mental illness was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors, which were thought to be the 4 basic elements that make up the human body. To treat mental illness, they would use methods such as bloodletting, which involved draining the body of blood, or purging, which involved inducing vomiting or diarrhea. These treatments were often more harmful than helpful and sometimes even led to death. And of course, there was also lobotomy, which was a procedure where a hole was drilled into the skull to allow the evil spirits to escape. But beyond these extreme cases, what about everyday life for someone with a mental illness? How would they be treated by society? Well, it depends on the severity of their symptoms. Someone with mild depression or anxiety might be able to function relatively well and live a normal life. They might even be able to hold down a job and raise a family. But someone with more severe symptoms would not be able to function very well at all. They would likely be unable to work and would be considered a burden by society. They might be shunned by their families and communities and left to fend for themselves. Ultimately, someone with a mental illness would have a very difficult time in ancient Rome. They would not be understood or treated fairly and would likely face a lot of hardship. You might be thinking, hey, I can speak Latin, so I'll be able to communicate and get by. But that wouldn't even help that much, because you wouldn't be able to communicate with everyone. The Roman Empire was huge and diverse. At its peak, it stretched from Britain to Egypt and included people from many different cultures. Not everyone spoke Latin, and even those who did might not have understood your accent. Plus, you wouldn't be able to communicate with animals or objects. So, unless you're planning on living in one place and not moving around, you would struggle to communicate with most people. And if you want to learn more about how you would struggle to do simple tasks in ancient Rome, check out this video. But now, let's talk about hygiene. You might think that brushing your teeth and taking showers every day is common sense. But back in ancient Rome, people didn't do either. Brushing your teeth was seen as a sign of vanity, and only the women did it. As for showers, public baths were common, but private baths were not. Instead, people would just wash themselves with a sponge on a stick. You might think that this would lead to a lot of disease, and that's true. People would get sick all the time from infections that could easily be prevented today. But there was one advantage to not bathing every day. Back in ancient Rome, everyone smelled bad. So if you were used to smelling bad, you wouldn't be bothered by it. Of course, you would still get sick from not bathing, but at least you wouldn't be bothered by it. So what if you're a woman? Being a woman in ancient Rome was not easy. They had very few rights and were seen as property. Women could own property and make business deals, but they needed a male guardian to manage their affairs. And they could only become free after their father or husband died. Women were also expected to be subservient to men and obey their husbands and fathers. And finally, women were not allowed to vote or participate in politics. This meant that they had very little power in society and were largely dependent on men. If you were a man, you would have had a much easier time in ancient Rome. Men had far more rights and freedoms than women, and were able to participate in pretty much everything that society had to offer. They were able to own property, vote, and hold political office. They were also able to travel freely and do whatever they wanted without having to ask permission from anyone. Ancient Rome was a very different world than the one we live in today. And if your brain was put into a body in ancient Rome, you would have a very hard time surviving. Between the lack of medical knowledge, the limited food supply, and the harsh social norms, you would be in for a very rough ride. So count your blessings that you don't live in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, people are often said to have lived in the moment. They celebrated life with feasts and parties, and were known for their love of pleasure. But they also knew how to get down to business when the time came. And this mix of hard work and partying made them one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. But if you're not born into the right family in ancient Rome, then your days will be filled with nothing but misery, poverty, and back-breaking labor. Your nights would probably be spent trying to find somewhere safe to sleep. So if you want to know whether you'd make it in ancient Rome, here's what you need to know about the rigid social hierarchy of ancient Roman society. Why you wouldn't make it in ancient Rome. First off, let's take a look at the people who would make up the upper class in Roman society. The patricians were the elite ruling class whose wealth and power were unrivaled. These were the senators and high government officials who held most of the land and made the majority of the money. For example, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, and he was considered a patrician. He inherited his status and wealth from his father, who also happened to be the dictator of Rome at the time. As a patrician, Augustus would have enjoyed all the privileges that came with being part of the elite ruling class. He would have lived in a mansion, probably owned several slaves to do his bidding, and had access to the best education money could buy. But don't think for a second that being an Augustus meant that you were free from responsibilities. In fact, quite the opposite was true. Being a member of the patrician class meant that you were expected to serve the state and uphold its values. Augustus, for example, was expected to maintain his father's position as dictator and to continue the expansion of the Roman Empire. If he failed to do so, he risked losing not only his own status, but that of his entire family. And that brings us to the next class, the equites. The equites were the middle class of Roman society, and they were generally wealthy enough to live comfortably without having to worry about where their next meal was coming from. They were often merchants, traders, or landowners who had amassed a considerable amount of wealth. But despite their relatively comfortable lifestyle, the equites were still subject to the whims of the patricians. They didn't have the same privileges as the upper class, and they were often called upon to serve in the military or in public office. And then there were the plebeians. Plebei were the common folk of ancient Rome, and they made up the vast majority of the population. They were the farmers, laborers, and artisans who kept the city running. But do unthink for a second that just because they were the majority, that they had any kind of power. In fact, the exact opposite was true. The plebea had very little power and were at the mercy of the patricians and the equites. They were often exploited and abused, and their voices were rarely heard in matters of public policy. Finally, we come to the bottom of the social hierarchy in ancient Rome, the slaves. Slaves were not considered citizens and had no rights or privileges. They were considered property and were bought and sold like any other commodity. Slaves were often captured in war or were the descendants of people who had been enslaved. They were forced to work long hours for no pay and were subject to brutal punishments if they tried to run away. So why you wouldn't make it in ancient Rome? Let's say that you're not born into the right family in ancient Rome. You're born a slave. Your life is pretty much doomed from the start. Your chances of survival are slim, especially in childhood. Life as a slave is brutal and unforgiving, and most don't survive to old age. Even if you do manage to make it to adulthood, your options are still pretty limited. You're a slave for life, and there's no real opportunity for advancement. You're stuck doing menial tasks, and your life pretty much revolves around serving your master. That's not to say that every slave has it bad. Some slaves are actually treated pretty well by their masters, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Most slaves are treated like dirt, and their lives are filled with hard work and abuse. Even if you're lucky enough to have a kind master, the fact that you're a slave still means that your life is pretty much worthless. You have no rights, and your master can do pretty much whatever he wants to you. So even if you're treated well, you're still pretty much screwed. So that's the first reason that you probably won't make it in ancient Rome. Being born a slave pretty much means that your life is doomed from the start. The second reason you probably won't make it in ancient Rome is that if you reborn a woman, women in ancient Rome had very few rights and were largely seen as property. They were expected to marry and bear children, and their lives revolved around the household. Even upper-class women, who had more freedom, were still expected to follow these traditional gender roles. Even if you're a woman who's born into a wealthy family, your life is still pretty tough. You'll be married off to some rich guy twice your age, and you'll have no say in the matter. You'll have kids, and your life will revolve around the household. You won't be able to work or pursue higher education, and if you try to break the rules, you'll be punished severely. The third reason you probably won't make it in ancient Rome is that if you reborn poor, life as a poor person in ancient Rome was tough. You'll be living in poverty, working long hours for little pay. You'll be competing with other poor people for jobs and resources, and you'll be at the mercy of the wealthy elite. If you get sick, there's no real way to get help, and you'll probably die young. Even if you do manage to survive, your life will be filled with hard work and struggle. You'll never really get ahead, and you'll always be at the bottom of society. If you're a poor person in ancient Rome, you'll be living in a small, dirty apartment with your whole family. There will be little to eat, and life will be hard. The fourth reason you probably won't make it in ancient Rome is that if you reborn a foreigner, ancient Rome was not very welcoming to foreigners. They were often seen as outsiders and were not allowed to participate fully in Roman society. They were often subjected to prejudice and discrimination and were not trusted by the native Romans. If you're a foreigner in ancient Rome, you'll be living in a ghetto and working low-paying jobs. You'll be isolated from the rest of society, and you'll have few friends. The fifth reason you probably won't make it in ancient Rome is that if you reborn during a time of war or unrest, life in ancient Rome was not always peaceful. There were frequent wars and unrest in the empire, and this could make life very difficult for ordinary people. During times of war, the food supply could be disrupted and people could go hungry. The constant threat of violence and instability also took a toll on people's mental health. People in ancient Rome were also victims of crime, and there was little to no law enforcement to protect them. It was up to each individual citizen to protect themselves and their property. This often led to vigilantism and violence in the streets. So, if you were born a woman, a foreigner, a slave, or poor, your life in ancient Rome was pretty much doomed from the start. You would likely die young, and you would never really experience the good things in life. Ancient Rome was a great city, but it was also a very harsh and unforgiving one. If you've ever wondered what life was like in the Eternal City, or how you could have been killed there before 1871, well then, keep listening. Ancient Rome is one of those places which seems like it should be hard to live in, like it's hot and crowded and smelly and dangerous. But modern depictions of the city are often inaccurate and tend to focus more on the gaudy architecture and military victories of this glorious civilization than the day-to-day reality. After all, if people wanted to visit Rome for its sights, they'd need to get there and stay alive to tell the tale. And really, the biggest challenge facing anyone living in ancient Rome would be surviving long enough to enjoy the sights in the first place. In fact, the idea that ancient Rome was a war-torn backwater only really took off in the modern era. Yeah, Rome did fight a lot of wars. They were a major player in the Mediterranean for centuries and the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But even though they were always fighting somebody, the vast majority of Romans didn't have to worry about getting drafted, because Rome was not a conscript army. They also didn't have to worry about their home getting pillaged by foreign invaders, because Rome was extremely good at winning wars. The legionnaires who marched across Europe and North Africa and the Middle East were disciplined soldiers trained in siegecraft and logistics. However, Rome's relationship with war was complicated because just because Rome was usually able to avoid being attacked, that didn't mean that their enemies weren't trying. In fact, the frequency of large-scale conflicts from 300 BCE to 300 CE was unprecedented in the ancient world. Every single generation saw conflict somewhere on Rome's borders, and every few decades the whole city would be on edge as a new Gallic chieftain or Numidian king or Parthian emperor threatened to take over the entire Mediterranean. These threats were so frequent that by the last days of the Republic, politicians in Rome tried to make laws against declaring war without consulting the Senate first, because they were sick of being dragged into pointless conflicts. So your average Roman might not have worried about being drafted into the army, but they absolutely had to worry about being drafted into the civil war. On one hand, Rome's system of elected officials kept the peace by allowing ambitious generals to climb the political ladder, instead of seizing power by force. On the other hand, Rome's system of elected officials allowed ambitious generals to climb the political ladder by force. When you spread power too thin, you end up with a lot of people who feel like they have a claim to more power than they actually do, and all they're missing is the excuse to grab it. And when Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, or Marius and Sulla fought over the Italian peninsula in 88 BCE, or Pompey and Caesar waged war in 49 BCE, or Antony and Octavian fought in 32 BCE. Romans everywhere had to choose a side. Of course, it was dangerous to choose wrong, but it was also dangerous to choose right, because no matter who won, the losers were going to get their heads chopped off. So you needed to be able to pick the right horse to bet on. So keeping tabs on who was shacking up with whom and who murdered whom was easy. But as a citizen of Rome, you couldn't afford to be distracted by gossip. But unlike modern neighborhoods, which are just places that have the same Starbucks, each neighborhood in Rome was composed of a bunch of people with shared interests. If you were a merchant, you'd hang out in the Vicus Caprarius near the Forum. If you were a fishmonger, you'd head down to the Vicus Piscarius on the banks of the Tiber. And if you were a gladiator, you'd probably hang out in the Vicus Celeratus, aka Gladiator Alley, where the taverns were cheap and the prostitutes were plentiful. Now, these neighborhoods weren't like guilds or something, but they did band together when their interests were threatened. So, when the Emperor Nero tried to build a huge housing complex in the Vicus Caprarius, the merchants teamed up with the local artisans and mounted a massive protest, complete with a petition drive and a boycott of the shopping district, that forced Nero to cancel his project and turn the area into a park instead. So you can imagine that when Rome was in the middle of civil war, it wasn't exactly peaceful. As rival factions fought for control of the city, they'd often use neighborhoods as bases of operations, forcing residents to choose sides or get out. Sometimes these factions would even wage war on each other in the streets. But there was also a chance that you could profit from all this chaos. See, while Rome was fighting itself, in 91 BCE, the social war broke out between Rome and its Italian allies. But the fighting also created a whole bunch of opportunities for people to get rich. Thousands of Italians flooded into Rome to take advantage of the city's expanding economy, which meant that the real estate market boomed. Roman aristocrats fled the violence and sold their properties at rock-bottom prices, which meant that savvy investors could buy a villa at a discount and rent it out to the flood of new arrivals. It was a risky investment, sure, but it was a chance to get rich quick in a world where slavery was legal and rampant. Or you could get rich slow by joining the merchant class. Trade was booming in the Mediterranean at this point, and the wealthier Romans were investing heavily in shipping. As a result, there was plenty of work for sailors, shipbuilders, merchants, and artisans, especially since everyone in Rome was focused on the civil wars happening around them. The provincial cities were largely being left alone and were growing rapidly. For example, Ostia, the port city for Rome, saw an explosion of trade in the late Republic, mostly because it was far enough away from the city that it didn't get involved in the wars. In fact, Ostia became so big and powerful that it eventually got its own harbor, mint, and military base. So if you were living in ancient Rome, you may have ended up there, whether you wanted to or not. Rome was notorious for being overcrowded and having terrible public transportation. So it wasn't uncommon for people to move to the suburbs. By the end of the Republic, Ostia had become the place to live if you were tired of Rome's constant drama. The population of the city quadrupled in just a few decades, and everyone who wanted to make money in the Roman world flocked there. Of course, none of this is to say that life in ancient Rome was easy or boring. There were still gladiators and emperors and plagues and earthquakes and locusts and everything else that makes living in a major city suck. But Rome wasn't always as violent and chaotic as it is today. And the greatest threat to its citizens wasn't necessarily coming from outside the city. You might think that living in ancient Rome would be super cool. Sure, there'd be no Starbucks, but you could walk around in a toga, pet a lion, and watch gladiators fight to the death. And if you were really into politics, you could get yourself elected emperor. But actually, life in ancient Rome wasn't all that fun if you compare it to how we live now. In fact, if you were transported back to ancient Rome, you'd probably struggle pretty hard. Here are 5 things you'd miss from modern life if you lived in ancient Rome. No one. If you wanted to travel, you'd need to go by foot or horse. You wouldn't even see a car until 1886, when Carl Benz invented the first automobile. So if you visited ancient Rome from the future, you'd have to go back to traveling on foot or on horseback. Oh yeah, there were chariots too, but those were mostly used for racing. For most people, walking was the best way to get around the city. But that could be quite tricky. You had to watch out for all the garbage in the streets, not to mention the crowds of people. Also, public transportation didn't exist in ancient Rome. There was no subway system or buses, and the roads weren't paved, so journeys could take a lot longer than expected. They did have boats though, but those were mainly for crossing the river. However, they did use boats as a form of transportation in the Mediterranean Sea. But you know, compared to our high-speed trains, airplanes, and automobiles, traveling in ancient Rome was a pain. Number 2, freedom of speech wasn't a thing in ancient Rome. Imagine you're in ancient Rome and you want to start your own blog. Well, sorry, but that wouldn't be allowed. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech and press didn't exist. Emperor Augustus established the first censorship board in 09 BC. Its job was to keep an eye on what people were saying about the emperor. If they deemed any statements false, they were banned immediately. The censors would also ban plays, poems, or books that they thought were insulting or offensive to the empire. They were also in charge of keeping an eye on the morals of the population. If someone was behaving badly, they might be banned from writing or speaking publicly. Also, women weren't allowed to speak in public. So even if you were a Roman woman who wanted to be a journalist, you couldn't do that. Also, they considered insulting the emperor or any other authority figure a very serious crime. And this wasn't just some small fine you'd have to pay. It could mean that you'd be put to death. So yeah, if you were transported to ancient Rome, you definitely couldn't speak your mind. No. 3. Slavery was everywhere in ancient Rome. When ancient Rome was at its peak, it had a population of about 1 million people. That made it the largest city in the world at the time. But a huge reason why they were able to support such a large population was because of slavery. There were about 2 million slaves in ancient Rome, which meant that for every 1 citizen, there were about 2 slaves. Slaves were used for all kinds of work, including farming, mining, domestic service, and even gladiators. Sometimes former soldiers would become slaves, as well as people who were captured during war. Slaves were considered property, so they could be bought, sold, and inherited. They had no rights and were treated like animals. Many slaves died from mistreatment, overwork, or starvation. Even though slavery has been around for thousands of years, it's hard to imagine how awful it must have been. 4. Public bathroom habits in ancient Rome were gross. In ancient Rome, people didn't use toilet paper, so they used a small stone or a piece of wood. But where they went to the bathroom is equally disgusting. Most people didn't have access to a bathroom. so they relieved themselves wherever they could find a secluded spot. You know, like in the streets, doorways, and sometimes even in the corner of a room. Urinals were typically located in taverns, shops, and marketplaces, and the urine was used for cleaning purposes. It was also common for people to throw their waste out the window. So if you were walking down the street in ancient Rome, you might get hit with some poo. Yuck. 5. Women's rights were limited in ancient Rome. If you were a woman in ancient Rome, your life would be pretty different than it is now. Women couldn't own property and had no legal rights. They couldn't vote or participate in politics, and they couldn't even make contracts. Basically, women in ancient Rome were considered inferior to men. A woman's place was in the home as a wife and mother. They were responsible for cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children. They could do some shopping and run errands, but they had to be accompanied by a male relative. If a woman was caught talking to a man alone, she could be accused of being a prostitute. Now, some women in ancient Rome were quite wealthy, and they could enjoy luxuries like chariots, servants, and beautiful clothes. But even rich women were still considered property. Their fathers arranged marriages for them, and they had no say in who they married. The good news is that women in ancient Rome could own a business, and some women were quite successful as merchants or innkeepers. But overall, life for women in ancient Rome was pretty tough. The year is 200 AD. Where are you? You're in ancient Rome. But how did you get here? Well, you traveled back in time via Boring History's new time-traveling t-shirt. But why are you here? Well, you might have seen the title of this video and thought that it would be an interesting place to visit. However, you soon realize that ancient Rome was actually a pretty terrible place to live, especially if you're coming from the 21st century. And there are several things that you would struggle with if you were alive back then. So let's jump into it. Now, you may be thinking that you could just blend in, or perhaps you could make money as a time traveler. Oh boy, oh man. Firstly, speaking Latin wouldn't be all that easy, despite what those Romans were doing. Even though Latin is the root of many Romance languages, including Italian, which is spoken just outside the window right now. Spanish, Portuguese, and French, they sound nothing like each other. This means that even if you decided to learn Latin, the chances are you still wouldn't understand any of the languages that are being spoken around you. So getting a job would be difficult. Perhaps you could use your knowledge of the future to make money. Well, unfortunately, the Romans had some pretty advanced technology for their time, but compared to today, it would mean absolutely nothing. Let's see if you can spot the things that you couldn't do in ancient Rome. Aqueducts, roads, and public buildings. Ancient Rome was built on swampland, meaning that it quickly became a muddy, smelly mess whenever it rained. To combat this, the Romans created aqueducts that brought water from outside the city into it. They also paved the streets with stone and designed public buildings that had toilets, surprisingly similar to today's modern society. But this isn't where the similarities end. The Romans loved public baths, and they were very hygienic people, even more so than the Egyptians. Public baths were places where not only could you wash yourself, but meet friends and talk about politics. But unlike today, the patrons didn't bring their own soap. Instead, they used a scratchy cloth and cold water. And don't think about asking for a towel dry, because that would be unthinkable back then. Now, since you've been living in the 21st century, you probably have forgotten what it's like to read a physical book. Back in ancient Rome, books were incredibly expensive, rare objects. and they were often passed down in families or copied by hand. Most people were illiterate, and the ones who weren't spent most of their time reading religious texts or poetry. If you wanted to be a writer, you had to rent an apartment in Rome, because that's where all the publishers were. This meant that your work had to be good enough to sell copies in the capital, and most writers failed. So unless you were wealthy and could afford books, or become the next big thing in Roman literature, you wouldn't have much access to written word. And since the printing press hadn't been invented yet, if you did get a hold of a book, it would take you hours to write something in it. That's why most Romans either memorized things or used wax tablets instead of paper. And you can't exactly go on Amazon and buy yourself a new one if you broke it. Now, when you go to the beach, you probably lather yourself in sunscreen and stay in the shade to avoid getting burnt. But back in ancient Rome, the sun was in. Emperor Hadrian even built a giant wall around the empire to keep the barbarians out. It might have worked too, except for the fact that the wall was built at the edge of the empire, hundreds of miles away from Rome. In fact, Romans believed that the further away from Rome you got, the more barbaric the people became. They thought that they were the center of the world, and everyone else was a dirty animal. And since the Great Wall of Hadrian didn't exist yet, anyone could walk into the empire. But as we mentioned earlier, the Romans were quite clean for the time period. They took care of their bodies, brushed their teeth, and wore perfume. So why did they stink? Well, it was all because of the garbage. Unlike today, trash wasn't taken away regularly, and there were no laws against throwing things out the window. And since there were no recycling rules, the streets would be filled with spoiled fruit, dead animals, broken pottery, and human waste, and the stench was absolutely unbearable. Not only that, but the streets were also full of people, animals, and carts. So it was nearly impossible to get anywhere without stepping on something disgusting. And if you wanted to use a bathroom, well, you would need to find a public bathroom, which was never clean either. So coming from the 21st century, it would be difficult to adapt to these conditions. Gladiators. They were professional fighters who entertained the public by battling each other or wild animals in the Roman Colosseum. Despite what Hollywood might tell you, gladiators weren't necessarily slaves. In fact, many of them were free men who chose to fight as gladiators because it paid well. There were different types of gladiators, and they were named according to their fighting style or the type of weapon they used. The most common type of gladiator was the murmillo, who fought with a sword and shield. Other types included the retiarius, who fought with a net and trident, and the threx, who fought with a dagger. Now, while the fights were fierce and sometimes deadly, they were also highly choreographed and followed strict rules. The gladiators had to protect their own lives, but they also had to put on a good show for the crowd. If they didn't, they risked being booed by the audience. Don't forget that even though you're watching this through a screen, the Romans watched these battles in real life, and the gladiators depended on their approval. So you can imagine how intense the matches really were. If you found a coin on the ground, you would probably assume that it's worthless. After all, they don't grow on trees. But back in ancient Rome, coins were made out of silver, gold, and bronze, meaning that they had real value. In fact, Roman emperors were known for debasing the currency by reducing the amount of silver in each coin. The economy of the Roman Empire was based on trade and commerce, and coins were essential for the smooth functioning of the economy. Merchants used coins to buy and sell goods and services, and travelers carried coins with them to pay for lodging and food. But having all these valuable items lying around wasn't safe, which led to a booming industry of moneylenders. These people would lend money at high interest rates to those who needed it, and then take their valuables as collateral. If the borrower couldn't repay the loan, they lost their valuables forever. In ancient Rome, transportation was a bit different than it is today. People didn't drive cars or take buses or trains. Instead, they walked, rode horses, or used other forms of animal-powered transportation. Walking was, of course, the most basic form of transportation, and most people did it for short distances. For longer journeys, people would hire a horse or donkey to ride on. They would also use boats and ships to travel over water. But as the Roman Empire grew, the need for faster and more efficient forms of transportation became apparent. This led to the development of chariots pulled by horses or oxen for longer distances. The Romans also developed a rudimentary road system that connected major cities and allowed for easier travel. But let's be honest, this is nothing compared to our modern transportation systems. We have airplanes that can take us to different continents in just hours, trains that can take us across countries in a matter of minutes, and cars that allow us to travel at the push of a button. Without these technologies, it would be extremely difficult to get around and travel. And now you know why it would be so hard to live in ancient Rome. Maybe you should ask your boring history t-shirt to send you back to your own time. But what about the boring history? You can't miss out on that, can you? No, of course not. What would you struggle with if you were an ancient Roman? What would they kill you for? And what would you miss from modern times? We're going to start out with the stuff that Romans would want to kill you for, because many of those things are actually still illegal today in some countries. In the time of ancient Rome, politics was very brutal. It was dog eat dog, and there were no rules. In fact, it was uncommon for Romans to fight in the streets over politics. And people could even challenge the Senate and the consuls to their faces. And there were consequences for doing so. If you wanted to speak against the Senate or the consuls, you had to be extremely careful about how you did it. Otherwise, you might end up dead. That's why many people chose to write their criticisms instead. This led to a lot of anonymous writings that we have today, which help us better understand what life was like during that time period. But these writings wouldn't have existed if the Romans had killed everyone who spoke against them. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were brothers who tried to reform the Roman Republic, but they were both assassinated before they could get anything done. Tiberius was killed by his own grandmother, Julia Maesa, and Gaius was killed by a senator named Marcus Junius Brutus. Both assassinations took place in the Roman Senate, which was supposed to be a place of law and order. But at that time, it was also a place where people could openly oppose the government without fear of reprisal. Of course, that changed when Augustus came into power and established the Roman Empire. The assassins were celebrated as heroes, but any opposition to the emperors after Augustus was brutally put down. If you were around in the time of Augustus, he would probably kill you for having red hair. There was a balding epidemic in ancient Rome, and the rich bought expensive perfumes and treatments in a desperate attempt to save their hair. They thought that baldness was a sign of weakness, so they did everything they could to cover up. Unfortunately, the treatments often ended up burning their skin or making them go blind. The worst part was that red hair was the most susceptible to balding, so people with that color were especially prone to these dangerous treatments. They would use whatever they could get their hands on, including snake oil and crocodile dung. One author even claimed that a senator paid 1,000 sesterces for a single strand of his own hair after it fell out. There were also balding cures sold by traveling salesmen that contained poisonous ingredients like arsenic and lead acetate. Even though these treatments were dangerous, they were still popular because people were so desperate. Caligula, who was emperor from 37 to 41 AD, would have been another person you wouldn't want to run into in ancient Rome. He was known for throwing gold coins from a tower, just for the fun of seeing common folk fight over the riches. Once he unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience at the gladiator games and watched with amusement as the crowds panicked and fell victim to poisonous bites. When Nero took the throne in 54 AD, he continued this tradition of cruel entertainment. He chained women to chariots like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. During one chariot race, he leaned out of his seat to watch the competitors more closely and accidentally tipped over. He spent the rest of the day laughing hysterically, while his advisors struggled to lift the overturned chariot back onto its wheels. Another time, he released venomous snakes into the audience at the Colosseum, and then hid under his seat as the crowds panicked and fell victim to poisonous bites. The two emperors after him also enjoyed watching people die, so you really didn't stand a chance during this time period. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 AD, liked to dress up like a gladiator and fight in the arena. He would choose his opponents based on their fighting style and experience. Most of the time he fought mimes, actors, and prostitutes, but he also had some famous gladiators killed so that he could fight their ghosts. These ghosts apparently appeared in his dreams and told him that he was afraid of them, so he decided to prove himself by fighting them in real life. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that these were just figments of his imagination, and he ended up killing several skilled fighters because of it. Septimius Severus, who was emperor from 193 to 211 AD, hosted feasts inviting 8 men of only one type, bald, short, or fat. He invited 8 men of each type and had them fight in the arena until only one remained standing. This may sound cruel, but it was actually quite common in those days. Gladiators weren't always slaves or criminals. In fact, many of them were free men who simply enjoyed the excitement of the games. The last person you wouldn't want to run into in ancient Rome was Emperor Domitian. He ruled from 81 to 96 AD and was known for his cruelty and paranoia. He had spies everywhere, and anyone who crossed him was put to death. He also chained chariots to chariots like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. When he wasn't busy spying on his own people, he was writing books and plays and forcing others to perform them for his amusement. After he died, the next emperor, Nerva, made it legal to curse Domitian's name. People took full advantage of this new freedom and cursed him relentlessly. If he were still alive, he would probably kill you for insulting him in that way. Now let's talk about the things that you would struggle with if you were an ancient Roman. Life in ancient Rome was not easy, especially if you were born a slave. Slaves were considered property and had no rights. They could be bought, sold, or given away as gifts, and their lives were often brutal and short. Many slaves died young from overwork, starvation, or abuse. The odds were stacked against you if you were a slave in ancient Rome. The society was built on the backs of slaves, and their labor was essential to the economy. Slaves were used in households, on farms, and in businesses. They were also used in the mines and in the gladiator games. Gladiator games were one of the most popular forms of entertainment in ancient Rome, and the gladiators were almost always slaves. They were forced to fight to the death in front of an audience that bet on their every move. Women in ancient Rome also had a tough life. They were considered property and could not own property themselves. They were also not allowed to vote or hold public office. The only way a woman could gain power was by marrying into a powerful family. Most women in ancient Rome were confined to the domestic sphere and were expected to take care of the household and raise children. However, there were some famous Roman women who broke these norms and made significant contributions to Roman society. Cornelia Metella was a Roman noblewoman who lived in the 1st century BC. She was known for her intelligence and her patronage of the arts. Livia Drusilla was the wife of Augustus and the mother of the first emperor's heir. She played an important role in Roman politics and was a major influence on her husband's policies. Julia Maesa was the grandmother of Caligula and the great-grandmother of Nero. She was known for her ruthlessness and her lust for power. Ancient Rome was also a very dirty place. The streets were often littered with garbage and human waste. There were no public bathrooms, so people would just do their business in the streets. The sewers were also very dirty and were filled with all kinds of waste. This created a breeding ground for rats and other pests. The lack of sanitation also led to the spread of disease. People would get sick from drinking contaminated water or from being bitten by rats. The most common diseases in ancient Rome were tuberculosis, malaria, and typhoid fever. These diseases could be deadly, especially for children and the elderly. Now let us discuss the things that you would miss from modern times. If you were transported back to ancient Rome, modern medicine has allowed us to live longer and healthier lives. In ancient Rome, the average lifespan was much shorter, and people were more likely to die from disease or injury. Without modern medicine, you would be at the mercy of whatever ailments came your way. You would also miss out on modern technology and conveniences. In ancient Rome, life was much more difficult. Everything had to be done manually, and there were no machines to help out. You would also miss out on modern comforts such as air conditioning and indoor plumbing. Life in ancient Rome was much more challenging, and you would definitely feel out of place. Modern education has come a long way since the days of ancient Rome. The literacy rate in ancient Rome was much lower than it is today, and most people could not read or write. Education was also not free, and most children had to work to help support their families. You would also miss out on the vast body of knowledge that has been accumulated over the past 2,000 years. In ancient Rome, people knew much less about the world around them, and they were more likely to believe in myths and legends. Overall, you would not enjoy going back to ancient Rome. Life was much more difficult, and you would miss out on many of the things that make life bearable today. Gladiators fighting to the death, chariots racing around a giant circle, and emperors being stabbed in the back. What? That last one wasn't in the history books. Today, we're answering the question, what you definitely should not have done in ancient Rome, with 7 historical parenting fails from ancient Rome. Number 7. You definitely should not have been born into an enslaved family. Imagine growing up knowing that your entire life belongs to someone else. If you were born into slavery in ancient Rome, this was your sad reality. Slavery was legal and widespread in Roman society, and there were more slaves in Rome than free people. Most slaves were prisoners of war or people who had been captured by slave traders. But it was unusual for families to buy people as slaves simply because they needed help around the house. It sounds awful, but it gets worse. Slaves in ancient Rome weren't considered property. They were considered people. The catch, however, is that it was perfectly legal to treat them like animals. Slave owners could beat their slaves without any legal repercussions. And things were even worse if you were a female slave. Not only did they face the same horrible treatment as male slaves, but they also risked being taken advantage of sexually by their masters. Now, this might sound like a no-brainer, but you really don't want to be a slave in ancient Rome. So it would have been a good idea to avoid being born into a family of slaves, if at all possible. No. 6. You definitely shouldn't have been a woman. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. Ancient Rome wasn't exactly a feminist utopia. Women in ancient Rome had very few rights. For example, they couldn't vote or own property. They were also expected to be submissive to their fathers and obey their husbands. In fact, a wife could be killed for being disobedient. But don't worry, boys. Things weren't much better for you either. Boys had to obey their fathers until they turned 25 years old. And if they were disrespectful to their parents, they could be severely punished, including being put to death. That's right, you could be killed for talking back to your mom. Now, it does seem like women had it worse overall, since they were generally considered inferior to men. But you know, at least boys could leave home at 25 and be independent. You know what? Forget it. It totally sucked being a kid in ancient Rome. No. 5. You definitely shouldn't have attended gladiator school. Let us pretend for a moment that you were born in ancient Rome and somehow managed to survive childhood. Congrats. Now let's say you decided to become a gladiator. Big mistake. Although Hollywood makes it look exciting, being a gladiator was far from glamorous. To start, you had to endure rigorous training that left many students injured or dead. And upon graduation, you'd be forced to fight to the death in front of crowds of spectators. Now, this might seem like an obvious career choice to avoid, but keep in mind that most gladiators were actually slaves or criminals. This meant that many gladiators didn't have another option but to fight to the death in the Colosseum. But if you were a lucky spectator who never ended up in the Colosseum, you probably wouldn't have wanted to attend gladiator school anyway. 4. You definitely shouldn't have tried to overthrow the emperor. A lot of emperors have lost their power and lives by attempting coups d'état, and some have even been assassinated by their own family members. That's right, you can blame family drama for the fall of an empire. Maybe you just can't win 'em all. Caligula was only 24 when he took the throne. He quickly became known for his debauchery, cruelty, and erratic behavior. His own grandmother, Julia Caesar, was so disgusted by him that she plotted with her son, Claudius, to assassinate Caligula. And guess who took the throne after that? Yep, Claudius. Just goes to show, even trying to overthrow the emperor won't get you anywhere. In fact, it'll probably get you killed. No. 3. You definitely shouldn't have played chariot games with your friends. Chariot racing was a popular spectator sport in ancient Rome, but it was also a dangerous activity to participate in. Charioteers were whipped into a frenzy as they pulled their chariots around the track at high speeds. It wasn't uncommon for horses to get spooked and crash, killing both the driver and any spectators nearby. But that was nothing compared to the Ben-Hur. Games were held in the Circus Maximus, which was so massive that chariots often crashed simply because the drivers couldn't navigate the tight turns. In fact, Chariot racing was so dangerous that Nero built underground tunnels beneath the circus, Maximus, so that spectators could escape in case of a riot or a deadly accident. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Maybe you should stick to playing dodgeball instead. No, 2. You definitely shouldn't have gone to the public bathroom. No matter how desperate you are to go to the bathroom, it's never a good idea to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome. Public bathrooms in ancient Rome were filthy and dangerous places. To start, they were extremely crowded, especially during public events such as gladiator games or chariot races. This meant that you were likely to be jostled or even crushed to death if you used a public bathroom in ancient Rome. But that was nothing compared to the toilets themselves. Public toilets in ancient Rome were often little more than holes in the ground. This made it easy for people to slip and fall, sometimes to their death. And to top it all off, public bathrooms in ancient Rome were a common place for theft. Since the toilets were so crowded and there was no privacy, it was easy for thieves to snatch your valuables while you were preoccupied. So if you ever find yourself in ancient Rome and desperately need to use a public bathroom, just hold it. No one. You definitely shouldn't have thrown a coin at Julius Caesar. On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was meeting with his advisors in the Senate when a group of conspirators attacked him. The conspirators stabbed Caesar more than 20 times, but he didn't die right away. As Caesar stumbled out of the Senate, he famously cried, "E tu, Brute," which translates to, "And you, Brutus." Brutus was Caesar's friend and adopted son, and he was one of the conspirators who stabbed Caesar to death. Although history remembers Brutus for his role in Caesar's assassination, he was just one of many senators involved. Cassius, Longinus, Ceruleus, Casca, Decimus, Junius, Brutus Albinus, Gaius, Trebonius, Marcus, Junius, Brutus, Lepidus, Lucius, Tilius, Cenber, and Marcus Porcius Cato all conspired to kill Julius Caesar. But you know who else had a hand in Caesar's demise? A random guy who threw a bronze coin at the back of Caesar's head and knocked him off balance. If he hadn't done that, maybe Caesar would have fought back, or maybe he wouldn't have been stabbed as hard and would have survived. The guy who threw the coin, Publius Cestius the Everus, was a poet and politician who later became governor of Cisalpine Gaul after Caesar's assassination. He wrote a poem about it and sent it to Caesar's widow, Calpurnia. In the poem, he described himself as the man who threw the fatal coin and claimed that he did it to save the Roman Republic. That doesn't sound very heroic, but who knows, maybe he saved Caesar's life. So we're not sure. Throwing a coin at someone's head is something you should try at home. Leisure was an essential part of life in ancient Rome. Forum. For those who don't know, the Forum was the center of ancient Rome. It was the place to be seen and the main thoroughfare for getting around the city. But the Forum wasn't just for business. It was also the center of social and public life. Here, you could find all kinds of entertainment, from street vendors to fortune tellers to gladiators practicing their fighting skills. The Forum was also home to a number of public baths, which were a popular spot for people to relax and socialize. These baths were open to everyone, free of charge, and they were a great way to meet new friends. You could take a dip in the pool, get a massage, or just lounge around on the warm stones. Either way, it was a fun way to spend an afternoon. A little further down the road from the Forum was the Colosseum, which is where you could catch a show of any kind, depending on the season. During the summer months, it was gladiator fights, wild animal hunts, or executions. But once the weather started to cool down, the shows moved indoors. And that's when the real fun began. During the winter, you could check out some chariot racing, which was always a crowd pleaser, or watch a reenactment of famous battles. These shows were so realistic that sometimes the crowds would get a little too rowdy, so much so that the emperors eventually had to ban them. But that didn't stop the people of Rome from finding other ways to enjoy themselves. They simply moved the parties underground. Now, these weren't your average frat house keggers. We're talking about full-on feasts with wine flowing like water and food fit for a king. The guests would arrive in chariots and on foot from all over the empire. There were poets and musicians, actors and acrobats, and the whole affair would last for days. People would come from miles around to take part in the revelry. So, if you were looking for a good time in ancient Rome, you knew where to find it. The Roman baths. Taking a bath in ancient Rome was more than just a way to stay clean. It was a social event. The baths were a place to meet friends, gossip about the latest gladiator fight, and maybe even pick up a date. This might sound strange to us now, but remember, most people in ancient Rome lived in apartments without any indoor plumbing. The public baths were the only place to go if you wanted to take a bath. That made them a very busy place. Men, women, and children of all ages and social classes came to the baths. Everyone shared the same pools and saunas, and it was common to see people of different walks of life rubbing shoulders in the steam room. Of course, there were some rules to follow when bathing in public. For example, you had to be clean before you got in the pool, and you couldn't bring a weapon. But for the most part, people were free to do as they pleased in the baths. You could swim laps, or just float around in the warm water. You could chat with your friends, or keep to yourself. Some people even went to the baths to read books or write letters. It was a great place to relax and escape the hustle and bustle of Roman life. What did the Romans do for fun? The answer might surprise you. When you think of ancient Rome, you probably imagine images of gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum, or citizens being chased through the streets by wild animals. But what did the average Roman do for fun? Well, according to a recent study, they liked to relax and socialize, just like the rest of us. The study, which was conducted by a team of archaeologists and historians, looked at a variety of sources to get a sense of how people in ancient Rome spent their free time. They examined everything from ancient Roman poetry to graffiti to uncover the hidden world of Roman leisure. The results were surprising. It turns out that the Romans were a pretty fun-loving bunch. They loved to take part in sporting events, gamble, and attend theatrical performances. They also enjoyed going to parties and socializing at taverns and brothels. Of course, there was plenty of violence in ancient Rome, but the study suggests that it was not as widespread or as common as has often been assumed. In fact, most Romans probably never saw a gladiator fight or an animal hunt in their lifetime. Instead, they preferred to spend their free time in much more civilized pursuits. The study paints a picture of ancient Rome that is both fascinating and relatable. It reminds us that even in the most tumultuous of times, people still find ways to have fun and enjoy themselves. So next time you hear someone say that ancient Rome was a violent, barbaric place, just break your fingers and let them know that it was also home to the most epic parties the ancient world had ever seen. Street food. Anyone who's ever visited Rome knows that the city is full of delicious food. From pizza to pasta to gelato, It's hard to go wrong when you eat in Rome. But what did the street food scene look like in ancient Rome? It turns out that the Romans were just as obsessed with street food as we are today. Back then, you could find all sorts of tasty treats being sold by hawkers in the streets. And it wasn't just food. You could also buy flowers, fruit, and even live animals. One of the most popular street foods in ancient Rome was roasted meat. You could get your hands on a juicy chicken or pork sandwich, which was perfect for a quick lunch on the go. Or, if you were feeling a little more adventurous, you could try some grilled octopus or squid. For those who prefer something a little less chewy, there was always the option of buying some fresh fruit. Vendors would sell everything from apples to figs to dates. And of course, no trip to the market would be complete without a refreshing glass of wine. If you were lucky enough to live near a beach, you could also pick up some fresh seafood. Hawkers would sell all kinds of fish and shellfish, which you could then take home and cook for dinner. Or, if you were really feeling lazy, you could just eat it as is. No matter what you were in the mood for, you could find it being sold in the streets of ancient Rome. So next time you're in the city, be sure to do some street food tasting. Who knows? You might just find your new favorite dish, chariot racing. Chariot racing was one of the most popular spectator sports in ancient Rome. Chariots pulled by horses or other animals raced around a track while spectators placed bets on the outcome of the race. The sport was dangerous and exciting, and it was not uncommon for chariots to crash or for horses to be killed. Despite the risks, chariot racing was a beloved pastime for many Romans, and the major races were some of the most anticipated events of the year. One of the most famous chariot races took place in the Circus Maximus, a large oval track located in the valley of the river Tiber. The race was part of the Roman festival of the Consualia, which celebrated the founding of the city of Rome. In 1932, the festival was revived and became known as the Grand Prix of Rome. The race was held annually on January and was one of the highlights of the Roman social calendar. The first Grand Prix de Rome was won by Gaius Appuleius Dioetus, a Roman senator and former charioteer. The race was a huge success, and it quickly became one of the most popular events in Rome. Chariot racing continued to be popular throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, it was during the reign of Augustus that the first purpose-built racetrack was constructed. This was followed by the construction of several other tracks throughout the empire. Chariot racing remained a popular spectator sport until the decline of the Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, chariot racing was largely forgotten, but it experienced a revival in the Renaissance. Italian noble families, such as the Medici and the Borgia, sponsored chariot races as a way of showing off their wealth and power. The sport continued to be popular into the 18th century, but it eventually declined in popularity as horse-drawn carriages became more common. Today, chariot racing is largely a historical footnote. However, there are still a few tracks in operation, mainly in Italy and France. Visitors to these tracks can experience the thrill of watching chariots race around a track at full speed. They can also bet on the outcome of the races and win prizes. So, if you're in Europe and you're looking for a unique experience, be sure to check out a chariot race. Just be careful not to lose all your money betting on the wrong chariot. There are many reasons why ancient Rome is often regarded as one of the most powerful and influential cities in the history of the world. The Romans were known for their engineering feats, magnificent architecture, legal system, roads, aqueducts, and more. But when we think of the lifestyle of the ancient Romans, especially the elites, one thing that comes to mind is their bathhouses. Bathing was not just a way to maintain hygiene in ancient Rome, but it was an important social event. And if you wanted to be seen with the most beautiful people in the city, then you had to visit the baths at the right time. The public baths were crowded places where merchants, artisans, slaves, and politicians would come to bathe, socialize, and relax. But there was a special group of people who flocked to the baths during the afternoon hours, and they were the rich and powerful. In fact, the wealthiest citizens in the city would not set foot in the public baths, preferring instead to build their own private bathhouses. Instead, these individuals were drawn to the springs outside of the city, springs which had healing properties. During the peak of the Roman Empire, around 2 million people lived in the city of Rome, which means that this was also the most densely populated city in the entire ancient world. The combination of so many people living in such close proximity resulted in a lot of pollution and unsanitary conditions. This was especially true in the public spaces like the baths, streets, and taverns. That's why the upper class preferred to take their baths in the therapeutic springs outside of the city, such as the famous baths of Caracalla. These baths were built by Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century AD, and they became a favorite spot for the wealthy. While they were open to the public, they were mostly reserved for soldiers and the emperors. Praetorian Guard. The reason why the rich were so fond of these particular baths was because they were filled with warm, sulfurous water. The sulfur in the water had healing properties, and it was believed to help with various ailments such as skin conditions and respiratory problems. For the wealthy Romans, a trip to the baths was more than just a chance to get clean. It was an opportunity to show off their wealth and power. They would arrive in style, riding in chariots, pulled by horses or even elephants. They would dress in fine linen and gold jewelry and parade around the baths. While others were bathing in the murky waters, they would lounge on marble benches or lie on beds of gold. They would also hire musicians to play for them and drink expensive wine while enjoying the soothing sounds. But the baths of Caracalla weren't the only place in the city where the wealthy Romans went to relax. Another popular spot was the baths of Diocletian, which were built by Emperor Diocletian in the 4th century AD. These baths were even more luxurious than the baths of Caracalla, and they featured a massive swimming pool, gardens, libraries, and even a zoo. The rich Romans loved to show off their wealth and power at these baths, and they would often throw lavish parties and feasts. The baths were also a great place to do business. Many wealthy Romans would meet up with merchants, bankers, and other members of the elite to discuss trade deals and make investments. They would exchange goods and services while relaxing in the baths and drinking fine wine. It was a great way to network and make deals while enjoying the comforts of the baths. Another popular spot for the rich and powerful was the baths of Sulpicius, which were located near the famous Palatine Hill. These baths were smaller than the other public bathhouses, but they were frequented by some of the most influential people in Rome. The elite enjoyed the baths so much that they began to build their own private bathhouses. These bathhouses were much smaller than the public bathhouses, but they were just as luxurious. One of the most famous private bathhouses belonged to the Emperor Nero, and it was located in his massive Domus Aurea. The private bathhouses often featured heated floors, mosaic tiles, marble statues, and fountains. They were a place where the wealthy Romans could escape the grime and noise of the city and relax in style. The golden age of the Roman baths lasted for several centuries, from the reign of Caracalla to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. During this time, the wealthy Romans enjoyed the benefits of the baths, while the poor and middle class made do with the public bathhouses. However, as the empire declined, the standards of hygiene fell, and the baths became less popular. Eventually, they were replaced by private toilets and indoor plumbing. Today, visitors to Rome can still explore the ruins of the great public baths and private bathhouses. They can imagine the sights, sounds, and smells of the ancient city and what life was like for the rich and powerful Romans. The baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian are among the best preserved and most visited sites in Rome. Emperor Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire from 161 to 180 AD, and he was known for his intelligence, his wisdom, and his commitment to justice. He was also a great patron of the arts and sciences, and he was responsible for building several public works projects, including the construction of the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all the gods of Rome. Under his rule, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, and he was able to keep the borders secure while expanding the empire's influence. However, his reign was not without its challenges. He faced several rebellions and invasions, including the Marcomannic Wars against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. Despite these challenges, Marcus Aurelius was able to maintain control over the vast empire and preserve its stability. He was known for his fairness and impartiality, and he was respected by both the Romans and the conquered peoples. However, Marcus Aurelius was not perfect. He was often criticized for his stoicism and his lack of empathy. He was known for being aloof and distant, and he was not very skilled in the art of public relations. As a result, he was not very popular with the general public, and he was often seen as out of touch with the common people. Despite his flaws, Marcus Aurelius is still considered one of the greatest emperors in Roman history. He is remembered for his intelligence, his wisdom, and his commitment to justice. His Meditations, a personal journal that he wrote for himself, is still read today for its insights into Stoic philosophy and the human condition. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire entered a period of decline that lasted for several centuries. The empire was plagued by economic problems, political instability, and military defeats. However, the empire did produce a few notable emperors during this time, such as Septimius, Severus, and Caracalla. Septimius Severus was a capable military leader who was able to restore order to the empire and defend its borders. He also undertook several building projects, including the construction of the Septizonium, a triumphal arch that celebrated his victories. Caracalla was another notable emperor who was responsible for building several public works projects, including the Baths of Caracalla, one of the largest and most luxurious bathhouses in Rome. He also introduced several reforms to the Roman army, such as the creation of new legions and the introduction of new weapons. However, these emperors were the exception rather than the rule. Most of the emperors during this time were weak, ineffective leaders who were more interested in luxury and pleasure than in governing the empire. One of the worst emperors of this period was Commodus, who was known for his cruelty, his extravagance, and his incompetence. He wasted vast sums of money on gladiators and chariot races, and he neglected his duties as emperor. He was eventually assassinated by his own mother, Julia Maesa. The decline of the Roman Empire continued throughout the 3rd century, and the empire was eventually sacked by the Goths in 410 AD. The Western Roman Empire was finally overthrown by the Germanic leader Odoacer in 476 AD, and this event is traditionally seen as marking the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Roman baths played an important role in the daily lives of the Romans. They were a place where people could relax, socialize, and do business. The wealthy Romans enjoyed the luxury of private bathhouses, while the poor and middle class made do with the public bathhouses. The golden age of the Roman baths lasted for several centuries, but as the empire declined, the standards of hygiene fell and the baths became less popular. Now, if you were suddenly transported back to ancient Rome, you'd probably have a really rough time adjusting to life there. The average Roman didn't live anywhere near as long as you do, thanks to some serious health and safety issues. We're talking about rampant disease, horrible air quality, and everyone walking around with really bad hygiene. On top of that, the Romans would likely see your modern clothing as the height of luxury, thanks to the abundance of linen and cotton that Europeans had access to during the 20th century. That means that even if you had brought along your winter coat, chances are it would be snatched right off your body and repurposed into a tunic or a toga. But given all these hardships, which one thing would you want to bring with you to ancient Rome? Would you bring a water filter to help keep you safe from disease? Maybe an air purifier to help you breathe through the smog? Or perhaps you'd bring along your cell phone so you could document your experience. Hey, at least it'll be one heck of a story to tell your friends back home, assuming you survive your trip. Well, whatever you bring will have to be small, because you'll need to carry it with you on foot. No horses allowed. Plus, once you arrive, you won't be staying at a hotel, but rather living with a host family, assuming you don't get thrown into jail first for wearing those fancy clothes. So what would you pick? Let me know in the comments below. And now, let's find out how you'd die in ancient Rome. Now, you've heard me talk before about how filthy Rome was, but it wasn't just dirty by our standards. It was actually considered pretty clean by those who lived there. Unlike today, when cities were considered dirty because they had sewage systems, Rome was considered clean because it lacked open sewers. Instead, it had a complex plumbing system that carried away water that needed to be drained, including urine, which had several uses in the Roman world. However, just because urine wasn't flowing freely down the streets didn't mean Rome was sanitary. In fact, the plumbing system was mostly used to transport clean drinking water. Wastewater was handled on a neighborhood level by the local aqueducts. They were usually a network of ditches and covered drains that emptied into a nearby river or out into the sea. These drains weren't cleaned very often, so they got pretty smelly, and being too close to them was considered unhealthy. That made housing in the center of town much more expensive than housing on the outskirts. This created a real estate divide in Rome, and the neighborhoods farthest from the aqueducts were some of the absolute worst places to live. For example, Testaccio was known for its full-on open drains, overflowing garbage bins, animal carcasses, human corpses, and overall stench. Meanwhile, a neighborhood like Monte was generally avoided by the wealthy because it was close to the Forum and the Palatine Hill, both of which produced lots of waste. Even though Monte was mostly free of open sewers, the general nastiness of the area meant that wealthy Romans wouldn't be caught dead there. So, if you value your life and you've brought an air purifier with you to ancient Rome, then make sure you choose your housing carefully. Sure, it may be tempting to live in the heart of the action, but moving to the suburbs might be a better option. And while you're taking precautions against the air quality, don't forget about the water. You might think that the aqueducts of Rome were used only to deliver fresh drinking water, but in reality, this precious resource was used for cleaning, cooking, and watering crops, as well as transporting waste. It was uncommon for pipes that delivered drinking water to be connected to pipes that carried away human waste. This wasn't too much of a problem when it came to urine, as it was considered sterile and was used for cleaning anyway. But things like feces and vomit were another matter. Since tap water wasn't safe to drink, citizens installed lead pipes in their homes that disconnected them from the public plumbing system. This may seem like a good idea, but it had the side effect of making the water even less safe. Lead poisoning was common among the wealthier members of Roman society, and it was especially dangerous for pregnant women. In addition to the water and the air, the ground itself was dangerous in ancient Rome. Sidewalks were rarely cleaned, and people were constantly stepping in filth, broken glass, and other debris. Roads were no better because they were unpaved. Instead, they were made of packed dirt, which turned to mud when it rained and rutted easily under the weight of chariots and elephants. Plus, the crowds of Rome meant that it was nearly impossible to avoid traffic accidents, either animal or otherwise. Each year, dozens of people were killed or injured by runaway animals, including chariots that collapsed or overturned. The crowds of Rome were a danger all by themselves. Between the bustling marketplaces and the popular spectator sports, it was easy to get lost or crushed in a crowd. You may think that you're careful and you watch where you're going, but there's no accounting for other people. People were constantly dying in the streets of Rome, whether from accidents, violence, or simply falling ill. Some of them were getting what we call the sniffles, while others were having full-blown epileptic seizures. With so many people packed into such a small space, it was impossible to avoid these unfortunate events, and you were likely to come across them at some point in your life. If you wanted to make your life easier, you could always spend money to avoid these problems. For example, you could hire someone to carry your poop out of the house instead of having to use the public toilets yourself. In fact, you could hire an entire staff to make your life more comfortable, provided you had enough money. But even if you did, that still wouldn't save you from the most terrifying aspect of Roman life: death. Death was everywhere in ancient Rome. From the moment you were born, you were on a timer. The average lifespan there was only 20 years old, and every day you got closer to that number, you'd witness death firsthand. Infants died all the time from disease or neglect. Children died from malnutrition or accidents. Young adults died in combat or from reckless chariot driving. The elderly died from well-being elderly. And this wasn't just sad. It was also a major pain in the neck. Losing a family member could be devastating, but it also meant dealing with their corpse. The Romans didn't have a whole lot of respect for the dead. They were quick to dispose of bodies in any way necessary. They were tossed into rivers, burned on funeral pyres, buried in mass graves, and even mummified. Yes, you heard that right. Mummification was common in Rome, though it was restricted to the wealthy. To prevent diseases from spreading, the corpses were treated with chemicals, wrapped in bandages, and stored in stone tombs. But even those elaborate tombs weren't safe. Grave robbers were everywhere in ancient Rome, and they'd steal the body to sell it to someone else who wanted to hold a funeral. Some people even made money selling plaster casts of famous people's faces. which they would make by covering a corpse in plaster and then chipping it away once it dried. Needless to say, this meant that if you died in ancient Rome, your face was likely to end up on a cheap roadside attraction. The people who died in Rome weren't the only ones whose bodies were treated horribly, however. Prisoners who were executed in the city were tossed into the Tiber River, along with criminals from other areas. The river was practically a sewer by the end of the empire, and swimming in it was considered unhealthy, though most of the time it was just disgusting. The poor sanitation of Rome meant that you had to constantly be on guard for disease. During the 2nd century AD, the Antonine Plague swept through the city and killed hundreds of thousands of people. Most of the victims were slaves or soldiers, but the rich weren't immune either. The plague arrived in Rome with troops returning from the east, and it spread quickly through the densely populated city. It's believed to have been the smallpox virus, and it struck people of all ages indiscriminately. Now, despite the dangers, it was still possible to have a pretty good life in ancient Rome. You just had to make sure that you weren't too attached to your comforts. You couldn't expect to go on a grocery run without dodging a dead cat in the street, or to go on a swim without contracting a parasite. If you expected that, you'd be miserable. But if you were willing to put up with the hazards of Roman life, you might have found it quite charming. You'd see the same people and visit the same places every day. Life revolved around the seasons and the weather, and your schedule was entirely dictated by daylight. There was a certain charm to it all, but that charm was completely ruined when you had to share the streets with poop-covered children and stray dogs. But now it's time to hear from you. If you were sent back to ancient Rome and you could only bring one thing with you, what would it be? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Boring History. If you did, please subscribe and leave a like. Until next time, remember, John shot first.